Hello and welcome to the Tag1 Team Talks, the podcast and blog of Tag1 Consulting. Today, we're going to be speaking with the technology leadership at APQC, the American Productivity and Quality Center, about their Drupal journey and their recent migration to Drupal 9. In the first segment, we talked about why they initially chose Drupal, their experience running the platform, and why they decided to continue using Drupal. In this segment, we're going to jump into the D9 migration itself and give you some insight into how they approached it and hopefully help you with your migration. I'm Michael Meyers, the Managing Director at Tag1 Consulting, and I'm joined today by two special guests, John Tesmer, the Executive Director of Information Technology at APQC, and Jim Gillilan, the Senior Architect and Lead of the Technology Team, who's known as Neck Limdahl on Drupal.org, has done a lot of core contributions and has been a long-standing member of the Drupal security team. Jim and John, thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thanks again, Michael.
So, for folks listening again, please, check out part one where we told you a lot about the organization and how Drupal was originally chosen. And it turns out that the reasons for choosing Drupal 8 were pretty much, similar. Drupal had only gotten better. The features, functionality, and reasons like the community that led to the initial decision, were even stronger. And so let's talk about the migration itself. You had made the decision to use, at that time, a Drupal 8 before you, went on to 9. How did you approach the project? Like, migrations are pretty gnarly,
Yeah, and we had a lot to work with. We had several 100,000 users in our database, not all of them active, but people come and go, so we needed to keep most of them. And we have a lot of content that we were pulling over that we needed to keep historical information on. So it was a pretty big project. And when we decided to move to Drupal 8, we ended up kind of having to break out different teams within it to kind of build out the new site and come up with the architecture and populate all the content types and come up with the model that the business was going to need to use, as well as start theming those, while at the same time we're coming up with all the mappings and the processes that were going to be needed to migrate to that new model. So I'm mostly focused on coming up with those and building them out into Drupal's migration system, which has a whole lot of tools for migrating. And it was very, it allowed me to iterate pretty quickly as the content model was changing during that process. It wasn't without its problems, but because of the size and the amount of data we were moving, I sometimes ran into problems with how Drupal manages its caches and long-term processes. But the migration, I ended up spending a lot of time on migration team meetings, talking through with the team and coming up with solutions. So again, the community kind of stepped up and helped us through that process.
Awesome. I think, when we were talking about the migration, one of the things that really stood out to me, you talked about how you sort of spun the design team out into this parallel path and how they were doing their work, in Twig and theming separately and it's in its own site, and then you incorporated that back. Can you give us a little sense of how that worked and why you chose to split it out? And
yeah, so we had a lot of different people with a lot of different skill sets, and some of them were very skilled in doing design processes, and they were familiar with different templating languages and Twig, and they brought a platform called Pattern Lab in, and they were able to iterate on that and build out different parts of the site, different widgets, and they call them atoms and molecules, and build up all the parts that would show up on different pages. And then the site building team that was building out the content model would be able to pull those into paragraphs and connect the different parts of the Twig model they were building in Pattern Lab into those paragraphs. And sometimes, they'd only be able to pull part of it. Sometimes they'd be able to pull most of it and just pass variables from fields into Twig variables and back and forth. But it allowed the teams to work pretty quickly with, the design team could sit with the business and go through all the models just in static pages and build out Twig templates and then hand them off. And the design team that was working with the content model could then connect all those back and go back and forth between them pretty quickly. So it allowed, as you know, with any big site projects, as you come in with this great idea of how everything's going to work, but when you get into the weeds, none of that lines up. Well, you know, some of it does, but most of it doesn't. And so you have to iterate pretty quickly, and that allowed those teams to go back and forth real quick and work with the different parts of the business through how they wanted things to work versus how people were publishing things, and figure that out.
No first contact with the enemy, as they say.
Divide and conquer, split up in different groups, site building, design, migration process, you know, in that iterative approach, you know, helps get a lot done quickly. You know, as you mentioned, your plans change, and also business needs. You know, one of the reasons, you know, you guys migrated is there's things that you wanted to do. You know, and as you start introducing, you know, these new changes, these new integrations that are, you know, required, you know, how did you manage sort of, you know, the business side working together with the technology side, you know, to go through this process?
Well, that's a question. You know, it kind of changed through the project. You know, I think we felt that we knew how everything worked going into the project, and we really figured out how things worked during the project. And a lot of the people that we usually didn't work with in IT, or we maybe see once or twice a year for a small project, were on like weekly calls with us, going through how we were going to change, you know, basically change the business, because our website's so tightly tied to the business. And it, you know, during that process, you know, there were so many things came up that, you know, we thought were fine before, and they're like, I really hate the way this works, and we designed it to work the way it had worked, you know. So then we have to iterate again and kind of come up with how that was, like, how that really worked within the business. And, you know, it was interesting.
Yeah, we made some friends. We lost some friends. No, it was, at the time I was on the business side of things. I wasn't leading the IT group. I was one of Jim's sort of business stakeholders. And part of the value that we deliver to our members is through the ability to take the data that was in my data warehouse and put it onto the web page that our members would see. And we had to make sure, as a part of this migration, that it was going to continue to be a transparent exercise for the end user. They should be able to log into the website. The system should determine what they're allowed to see to a very fine degree of granularity, and then present that data from a data warehouse that Drupal doesn't really know much about. So, you know, there was a lot of iteration, I would say, and it kind of led to a very robust sort of behind the scenes API that it connects all of our systems today, you know, more than I think we thought it would at the time. So we've continued to build and iterate and develop on that. And I'll tell you that as a business person that had to work with the technical team, it didn't seem to hurt. We were able to get the problem solved, and there wasn't a lot of technical boundaries that we had to break in order to make it work. So it was good.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like you guys make it look easy, you know, and we talked about earlier, you know, the hidden technical complexities and the, you know, like there's a lot going on under the hood with the integration through these APIs and all these different systems and the heavy degree of granularity. So, you know, when someone comes to you and says, you know, I want this little feature, and it seems like pretty simple from their perspective, you know, like, how does that conversation go?
We've had to develop some pretty rigorous methodologies internally for what I'll call like project management, I guess. You know, we've kind of had to hybridize the typical agile approach just to keep the business people focused on solving the problems they want to solve. So when they do come to us, we can kind of draw a box around what they're trying to do and conceptualize it, and then move it through in kind of an agile way until it gets, you know, fully implemented out there. But that's really been a critical kind of development for us, and it's something we're constantly iterating on, just the methodology of how we deliver that work. So
it sounds like it really strengthened your relationship with, you know, sort of the business side of the organization, and John, you coming over from the business side of the organization. So, you know, a lot of great changes in sort of that partnership. What about the changes on a development front and the workflows? Like, you know, D6 and D8 and 9 are two different worlds, two different, you know, in technologies. You know, what was it like to go through that change? from a technical standpoint? And would you say you came out better the other side? Do you like the new way?
Yeah, it was a big leap. And I definitely would say that I feel like we're better off. There's so many more tools in Drupal 9 that I can use. I didn't have the queue system that I can offload tasks to. I didn't have like the sort of the build arrays and caching system that allow me to pull in data from an API and set a time limit and not worry about it. There's all sorts of tools within Drupal that I have now that are just leaps and bounds better, but also it allowed me to kind of move our tool chain forward. And that was probably one of our biggest roadblocks we were running into with Drupal 6, was that we were, just so far behind the curve, even back then, that, we couldn't, people wanted all these dynamic applications and stuff like that, and we just couldn't deliver because we'd have to build an entirely new system on top of Drupal 6 to be able to deliver those sort of tools. And now, I can just throw an API together that within Drupal and build out some small application in Vue and have that compiled up, and they can talk and everything just kind of works. It's a lot quicker to build those sort of things now that we have all these tools with Node and Pack Composer, or I can pull in a PHP library from all these great new PHP libraries that exist and develop things out. It's been a huge leap forward in the tooling that we can use. And as Drupal 8 has progressed into Drupal 9, it's just new features all the time that just kind of seamlessly work, and it's been super stable for us. So it's been really great to be able to have that platform to work off of and be able to focus on all the new features and new functionality that the business wants to build out.
And I'll tell you, as the interface between Jim and the business, a lot of times it's been great to be able to be ahead of their expectations. So if they come to us and say, like, for example, we're doing this project interactive content, and that's a real great example of putting an API on top of Drupal but merging some features with Drupal. We were able to kind of lead the business, I think, faster than they expected and much less expense than they expected for that capability. And I totally attribute that to the capabilities that Jim has available to him. So, when I'm having a business conversation and like, that we want to do this with the site, want us to do this way, I can kind of talk to Jim and figure out, all right, technically it's feasible, and it's not really that big of a problem. We can move that along pretty quick. And it's been great.
You guys really changed and deepened your relationship and interaction with the business team. You changed your tooling also for the better, really helping the technology team. What about infrastructure? Did you guys go for the trifecta? What were you doing and what's going on that front?
We didn't change their infrastructure that much, but we kind of, I tweaked a few things. We can use some Docker containers to kind of help our build process a little bit, but for the most part, I was able to kind of keep the infrastructure it is and keep focused on building out the new site. And we're currently kind of looking at how we're going to change that and move it into a more modern infrastructure.
I think that's a really smart decision. Making too much change at once is, hugely risky. And you guys made a really impressive amount of change in a really short period of time. It makes a lot of sense to put that off. There really isn't too much to be gained in doing that at the same time, and way too much to be risked. So we talked a lot about what went, smoothly and great. I want to dig into the challenges a little bit more. And the infrastructure is a good segue in the sense that, I know one of the challenges we worked on is search, and you guys, went from having a really impressive and complex solar system internally, and you did choose to spin that component out to a SaaS service provider, both a benefit, in reducing complexity and offloading a lot of server maintenance and support, but also a challenge because that was like a key part of the application and infrastructure. Was that one of the bigger challenges, and why?
So search has been one of our bigger challenges because it's the business kind of has to understand how they want to make changes to a search engine, and trying to teach somebody how Solr works or how stemming works or how complicated processes within how search engines work it's not something that they want to deal with, and it's hard to communicate back and forth between the business. And so that was like a huge challenge for us. It was a big challenge before we moved to Drupal 8, but it's because we've been moving so quickly, within Drupal 8, it's become even a bigger challenge for the business. And that's kind of what led to us looking to offload into search stacks and being able to move that into an external service where they could manage that interaction with tools and all the analytics on top of Solar that we didn't have to build out
and maintain. We're a small IT team. Yeah. It's Jim is he's like the core developer, and then we got a couple contract guys that come in and out and do stuff, and some of the things that our business people wanted us to add were just, it would be a lot.
Yeah, but I guess the bright side of that is that within Drupal, all of the tools are in there. That's been pretty seamless to be able to work with Search API and the config system and be able to swap configurations back and forth, and work with testing it on the Search Stacks platform, and then come back and work with and iterate on our known platform when we're working on other features. So even though that's kind of a real hard problem for us, it's again the flexibility and the tools within Drupal have kind of given us the ability to deal with that.
What about other challenges? I mean, this is a pretty big project. What would you say, outside of search was another big challenge that you had to deal with?
So the migration process also wasn't without hurdles. I think I mentioned that we ran into a lot of problems with the memory, being able to have those long running processes. The migration ended up taking like a day and a half. And having that run for that long, it was a challenge.
Probably the environments too, right, Jim? I mean, manage different environments because of that much data.
Yeah, and we've also, that's a problem that we're going to be looking for in the future, is figuring out how to deal with environments, because we're moving through so many features now so quickly that the business wants to look at all of them individually. And I can't have them spin up a test at their own local dev environment and look at this branch and look at that branch, or I can't sit with them and do that. So we need some way of looking into that. Tugboat or any of these new systems for kind of dynamically building up environments are definitely in our future.
So, a lot of the complexity of the application, like we talked about, is really hidden. And as you really dig into this, both from a technical standpoint and from a business standpoint, these technical and sort of functional complexities start to surface. Just the sheer scope of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think traditional sort of Drupal sites are basic CMS sites, right? So somebody might spin up Drupal, load some content into it, and then maybe have a real simple kind of integrated stack that kind of begins and ends at Drupal, maybe some SaaS stuff in the cloud. You drop a pixel or whatever for tracking, and that's kind of the end of it. But for us, it goes even more. I mean, we have obviously a CRM system that's related to Drupal in some way, so that we know who has access to the content. We can manage that access outside of Drupal. We also have a data warehouse that publishes benchmarking data, requires granular access controls. So we had to create some APIs on how people could get access to that content. So now we've kind of broken out of that silo of content all exists in Drupal, and it has to be managed outside and brought in and permissioned the same way. And then on top of that, we have traditional marketing website stuff to try to get people to understand who we are and what we do, and our unique position in the world as a 40-year-old nonprofit in the best practices space. There's not a lot of people like us, so we have stuff like that. We also have just traditional like job sites, like what positions are available at APQC. These are all pieces of content that everyone else has to manage, but we also have the added complexity of the benchmarks and the PDFs and the best practices and stuff like that. And I think it has created a lot of innovation for us internally, and we move really quickly. Jim's been just amazing as a technology person to solve these technical problems and make it look really easy. Jim's amazing at that. And I know that a lot of what makes it possible for him is the ecosystem, right? The Drupal kind of platform and the ecosystem that he has available to him, and the people that he can sort of call on to get his problem solved. I mean, we haven't yet found a problem that is unsolvable for us in a reasonable amount of time. I mean, when in 2016, when we wanted to launch a new complete application platform called Mosaic, we actually built it as a separate sort of application. We're able to bring it in with Bakery, and so people did single sign-on. We just brought on an e-learning platform that was completely independent of our site. It's a platform for e-learning. We were able to integrate it, single sign-on, using modern web integration techniques that in Drupal 6 we couldn't have ever done. But it's the amazing thing is, whatever the technology problem is, we got the talent in-house and the ecosystem to support us to solve any of those business problems.
Yeah, and I second that. I had the opportunity and pleasure of working with Jim, gosh, maybe 15 years ago now. And you are amazing and a huge asset. And I think one of the great things that Jim brings to an organization, and something I want to mention to people, is he is involved in the Drupal community. And so you guys talked about the challenges that you had with the migration module. He has the relationships in the cloud, in the community, to reach out to these people and say, hey, we're having problems, here's solutions, and let's help make that happen. And I think it's a really important reason for organizations to support and get engaged in the community, and to support the developers in the community that are building these platforms, because it is an unbelievable advantage. It really unlocks the technology. It brings you to a point where there's little that you can solve as a result of it. And so
yeah,
it's great that,
And I'll tell you, from the pointy-haired boss perspective, that a lot of companies, I think, don't recognize the value of the open source community and the Drupal community as an extension of that. But it's really in line with our mission as an organization. I mean, our mission is basically to identify best practices, to disseminate them widely, and to bring people together, which is very, very cohesive with a lot of the open source kind of ethos, right? We figured this cool way to do something out, let me contribute it back. And I mean, Jim and I are always looking for ways to try and help out in the community. We're always trying to, can we push this out? Can we make this a library available? Can we give back? Can we give back? Because it's been great. I mean, it's helped us, our little slice of the world. We have customers around the world. We have people in every corner you could ever imagine, in every industry, in every country, and they benefit and they improve their own productivity as a result, and their lives are better. So it's just, we're taking that kind of open source ethos and just kind of pushing it out there in things that aren't software.
I really appreciate the approach that you guys do, and it's a pleasure to work with you, because you're so willing to improve Drupal. So looking back, would you guys change anything? Would you choose Drupal again? Now that you've been through it, what do you think?
I mean, I'm in love with the Drupal community. So it's a no-brainer for me, and I've got basically family in the community now, that going back since I've been here for so long. And like you said, like if I take a problem and I spend an extra hour or two on it and work with the community on it, that pays back double the next time I have a problem, because somebody's already working on that problem within the community, or they remember me from helping with that, and that they'll engage a little bit quicker. So I would in a heartbeat do it again. It's definitely been worth it.
Yeah, I mean, from a business perspective, I don't even have to justify any kind of version upgrades that happen. I mean, it's just our operating system now. It's what we do, and I can't imagine us making a change.
I love that. Drupal is the operating system of the business.
Yeah.
I'm totally going to steal that. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. This was really insightful. I really appreciate you sharing not just what went well, but also the challenges and where you guys are going from here. So thank you so much for joining us. For our listeners, don't forget to check out part 1, the intro and background on APQC, why they first chose Drupal, and planning the migration. If you like this talk, please remember to upvote, subscribe, and share it out. You can check out our past talks at tag1.com/TTT for Tag1 Team Talks. As always, we'd love your feedback on this show, as well as topics and suggestion ideas for the future. You can email us at ttt@tag1.com. That's tag1.com. Again, Jim, John, a huge thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who tuned in today.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.